Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay Moore.
This is Greg Cruz.
This is Bryce Vine.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This
East.
is Sebastian Younger.
This is Daryl Ames.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
This is Dr. Bob Greenberg.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
Hi, this is Bob Dvorchak, author of Drive On, and you're listening to the Break It Down Show.
And now, the Break It Down Show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
Yes. We got Bob Dvorchak. He's a Tactical 16 author. He's written this book, Drive On, but he's written a lot of things. Maybe you've heard of him as Bedouin Bob. He's been writing. He's one of the guys like when your mom and dad say, don't get an English degree. You'll never make any money. He got one 50 years ago, basically, and has been making money ever since writing and telling stories. You are a master storyteller. You are steeped in not just Pittsburgh and Pennsylvania sports, but just sports in general. I mean, I listened to an interview with you talking about the passing of Gordie Howe and the kind of player he was, and you know a lot about, well, you wrote about the Penn State thing. You also wrote about Jeffrey Dahmer, and so you just sort of get around the whole Midwest over there. And it's neat to see what you're doing now and moving on. Let's just real quick cover a guy who's written for a lot of people, a lot of things. Why Tactical 16?
Well, Tactical 16 actually gave me a chance to get this book published. I kicked it around with a couple of publishing companies over the years. Nobody seemed all that interested in it. But when I pitched it to Eric at Tac 16, that he thought it was just a tremendous idea. It was a way to, and his thing is, if you write it out, if you write down your thoughts, it's a way of healing those inner wounds that occur through the years. That's why I'm with Tactical 16. They gave me a break.
Yeah, it's a good reason. And for those of you guys who are going, who the heck is Bob Dvorchak again? Go to Facebook and type in Drive On in the search window, and you'll see a picture of him. The Uncensored War of Bedouin Bob and the All-Americans. And Bob and I both have worked with the 82nd Airborne Division in different brigades and whatnot, but we've definitely been out and seen a lot of that time. You were talking about healing affected by writing. What kind of damage comes to the guy who's the chronicler of stories? What healing do you need to do?
Well, I lived with those troops. I was out there in the sandbox with them when you have to mask up at night when the gas alarms go off, and you cross the line of departure with them, come to grips with your own mortality. You have that conversation that one night where you say, hey, look, maybe I'm not coming back from this, so I better make peace with myself. And you go through that whole process. Ultimately, when you come home and you say, well, now I can really tell this story, and people kind of shrug and say, and move on, the story's over. So I kind of carried it with me for almost a quarter of a century.
Yeah, it's crazy. I do a lot of explaining what combat is really like. And there's a lot of downtime. And there's a lot of things that just kind of slowly gnaw at you, even if you're not conscious of it. But I have no doubt that you have some kind of a packet on your person or back in your room that says, Bob got blown up today. What do we do? Who do we contact? Where do we go? And you carry that with you because you have to. There may not be enough of you left. So that's something that nobody in the civilian, normal, calm world has to ever deal with.
Right. When people put their lives on the line, it means what it says. You got to be ready to take that step, and that means going all the way in. So, I carried dog tags with me. I actually had those, but still, it was just a whole experience going through this, and you don't really understand it at the time, but your life changes. It's like all the molecules in your body get rearranged, and you come back a different person, even if there are no physical scars. You got some emotional things to deal with.
Yeah, I remember when I first came back for good after being gone for a very, very long time. I'd lived with a bunch of infantry dudes on the side of a mountain, where they had to airdrop supplies in, and we'd work out together, and there'd be Metallica playing in a gym, and the gym is really just a bunch of I know it sounds like a house, but this is a shack, with 2x4s and plywood, and we'd be in there just like, dun, 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 getting fit and trying to stay healthy so we could get out and do the job. And then a couple of weeks later, I'm in a yoga studio with a bunch of middle-aged women, and it's like you're on a different planet. What's your story like that, Bob?
Well, when I got back from Desert Storm, and I flew back to Bragg with the 82nd, and 1 week after being in the Euphrates Valley, I was riding the subway, the E train, into Manhattan to go to work at my office in New York City. And I got to tell you, I was looking around at, hey, that's a good ambush site. There might be a sniper behind that post. It's just as if you had ventured to a different world or a different universe, and you'd come back through the same door, but the world's the same. It's you that's changed. It was me that had changed. So that was what I felt.
Yeah. Yeah, and then like you said, you're like, oh my gosh, this experience is incredible. Everybody should know about it, and yet nobody even cares to know about it, and it's damaging, right?
Well, it is. It's like, well, do they not understand? Do they not care? Did any of this mean anything? But of course, it meant something to me, and I learned along the way that nobody owes you anything. Nobody's going to, bend over backwards to listen to your story. So, but you have to get it out, if nothing else, for your own sanity.
The sanity part is good. Like, just, okay, nobody has to read this, but I'm going to write this book for me. And that move alone, I think, takes a lot of surrendering of ego, because now you're writing a book just because you have to, and there's just not a lot of room for the ego side of your psyche to push that out. You've written way more books than me. I've never written a book, but I've also created a lot of content here with the show, and I know that I can let perfection get in the way of letting the audience learn along with me what I experienced. Do you have a similar thing, a mechanism maybe as you're writing? Because some stuff doesn't make the cut. Some stuff does, and sometimes you're just like, you know what, this just needs to get written.
Well, exactly. It's some of the best material gets put on the cutting room floor, too.
Yeah.
Because there are just certain things that you don't talk about. But I did learn along the way, there is no need to be perfect. Nothing's perfect.
Right.
Especially the situations I'm writing about. War is just, it's just a brutal, raw. It happens, and there it is. So don't reach for perfection. You're not going to ever get that. But you just kind of, it's like logistics. You just got to push them through sometimes, and don't worry about it.
As you were trying to put together your book, let me just back this up. I have a book that I'm trying to write, and I've struggled a lot with it because I don't exactly know what to write. I've got over 1,000 combat missions. I've got plenty to say. But I've struggled with the format of, is my book a how-to war book? Is my book just a memoir? I don't want it to be Pete is a superhero book, but when you stay for so long, you get better than everybody else. They come in, they're all rookies, even if they've done it before, like, oh, I've been on my 3rd deployment, and I'm like, I've been here 3 deployments straight. So, so I've struggled with trying to put that together, and the book is about me, but it's not celebrating me. I've definitely struggled with that. When you were trying to put your book together, obviously you're a way more seasoned writer than I am, but did you have a sense for, is this a story of Bob? Is it Bob in the 82nd? Is it the 82nd and Bob's admiration for him? Well, how did you deal with that?
Funny, and I go back to basics. Every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So you start at the beginning, and you say, what do I want this book to be? Well, right. The book it's like wrestling an alligator. You clamp down on the jaw, and the tail will smack you in the head. Or you worry about the tail, and the jaws open up. It takes its own form. Now, what I decided to do was to write this book and I kept a journal, so I had written a bunch of things down, was to write it as my personal experience of going through a war. And ultimately, I went through that war attached to the 82nd Airborne Division. Right then and there, that's the outline of of a really good story in my mind. So I stayed true to sort of like the context of it from the beginning and just let it go. Because every step along the way, you get in a little deeper, and this journey takes you to a place where, in your case, very few people have ever gone. That's vehicle enough.
Yeah, definitely. It's the thing I know I can do is I know I can talk about it and record it and put it up in podcast form. What I don't know that I can do is put together 300 words in a way that makes sense to me. And also, quite frankly, it's a big endeavor, as you're well aware. I've got to know that it's worth my time to do it. Like I can just keep doing this indefinitely, and there's always new stories to tell. But writing a book is, I don't know, 2,000 hours of work.
It is a lot of work. Remember this: writing is easy. You just wait for the beads of blood to form on your forehead until it drives you insane until you have to write it down.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Listen, I'll be honest with you. I've done this for 50 years. I hate to write, but I love having written. After it's over, it's like this woof. It just feels a whole lot better emotionally and mentally to have it done.
Yeah, and let's be honest, I want the rewards of having written a book, but I haven't wanted to put the work in, which isn't fair. I've put some of the work in. I've got a large portion of it done. It's nowhere near complete, and the show takes up a lot of my time. So I've focused my efforts here for the time being. But I go back to it and I'll put 10, 20 hours into it, and then and let it sit until the blood beads up on my forehead again.
Right, and the thing is, there's a temptation to think that, well, I'll just get the most important part out first. If you could tweet it in 145 characters, well, everybody could publish something. And it's that discipline to just start and let it tell itself and take it in a sort of almost a chronological way, which gives it a certain discipline all its own.
Yeah. Yeah, and the other thing is, and I'm talking about from my perspective, I interview a lot of us, the people that have been there, told the stories, and so I'm like, oh man, they did such a great job. I wish I would have written these chapters. They're so powerful. I definitely could have done that. But how do you differentiate when a lot of the stories are, they're all different, but you have to have a place in the marketplace for your book, and it feels to me a lot of times like there's just so many of these books that have already come out. My story's completely different, of course, but I'm not a SEAL, I'm not a Green Beret. Yes, I'm a spy, but a lot of my story isn't like, no shit, there I was, on the spy bridge or something like that. So my spy story isn't even a traditional spy story.
Well, but it is yours. And that's what makes it unique. They're all different. There are so many books out there. What makes yours stand out is the fact that it's very personal. And there's one truism about war is that it's a different experience for everybody, because most of what happens to you internally, what's going on inside, and your reaction to it.
Yeah, no, for sure. So the last time you were in a combat zone, was that in the Gulf War, or did you get back out for the current conflicts?
No, that was the last time. I was on deck to go back to Iraq the second time, but my newspaper publisher said decided at the last minute to send one of his own people, one of his favorite people, rather than me, as if that was like some big sacrifice on my part not to have to go back. But yeah, when the second Iraq War came around, I was ready to go and was geared up for it, but didn't leave.
It didn't work out. Yeah, so I want to ask you this a little bit. So my job is to be outside all the time talking to the locals so I can know things that nobody else knows and understand what's important to the commander. The commander will give you a list of things, 150 things I'd like to know, but they're all threat related, and rightfully so. But there's another 5,000 things that you need to know on top of that you don't even know to ask those questions. So I sort of worked primarily in that space. Threat based for sure, but that's almost like a gimme, right? So me being outside all the time, I had a tremendous network of people that would tell me things, either passively or actively. And when we had embedded reporters, I gotta tell you, and this isn't critique of you, but we had embedded reporters. Those guys often missed all of the story, and literally had no idea what was going on.
Well, and I think the reason for that is they go out there with this preconceived notion of what it's going to be like, and they keep waiting for the action. And as you said, it's one of Murphy's Law. War is, 90% stretches of boredom, punctuated by the sessions of sheer terror.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it. But you can't ignore the parts that lead up to it, and what somebody's doing, getting ready to lock and load and going out on a night ambush, and what they're thinking about, and what their thoughts are at home. I mean, that's as important as the mission itself, in my mind.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. There's the details of war are often they're fascinating. Just the different things that you have to do, and the tales of even because the action is so extreme, it's hard to even translate. You get into a firefight, you can write very linearly about that fight and miss so much other stuff because there's more going on than you can take in. You've seen this.
Oh, exactly. It's almost you almost have to recreate it. There would be 10 guys in a line, and the guy on the left and the guy on the right will tell you a completely different story than the guy in the middle, because it does happen so fast, and there is so much going on, and what you see is that vision in front of you. So it's almost like you have to do it after the fact, because nobody is capable of writing about it as it's going on.
Right. And then if you're like me, you could take that whole battle story that you write, and you could write a completely different one with the exact same circumstances, even the same people, You could chew it up and go ahead.
I'm running into that right now. Yeah. I'm working on a new project, and it was the 3rd Brigade of the 82nd Airborne in Vietnam.
Uh-huh.
So I'm recreating, and I have the skeleton of their history, and I'm writing it from their point of view. But two guys in the same battle tell me a completely different story, and it is the same action. And you're absolutely right. I could write it this way, and when it's done, I could go back and write it another way altogether, and it would be the same book. It would be the same story, but from a different point of view and different outcome.
Yeah. When we're talking about the 82nd, too, just for the audience, we're talking about probably, and if not that, arguably the most decorated division. A division, okay, so a brigade has about, and I'm being very big on my number, about 5,000 people in it. So a division is a collection of brigades. So it's a massive body of people, and they've been in their resume of fights is crazy. So when you're writing a history, when you're in the unit, and I'm sure, Bob, you experienced this, when you're with the unit as well, you have to respect that legacy, because they were at Market Garden, they were at Battle of the Bulge. One of their icons of the division is a guy standing there with nothing, basically, and saying, they're not going to get past us. This is as far as they go.
This is as far as the bastards are going to get.
Okay, yes.
And it was a grunt in the Battle of the Bulge, probably the most badass guy, quote, in the 82nd Airborne Division history. But and it goes back 100 years, back to the Doughboy. When you're talking about World War I and fighting in the trenches of France. So all of that is part of them, and they identify with that.
The Battle of the Bulge, and granted, this is the 101st we're talking about now. The Battle of the Bulge was so crazy that the Germans offered, to allow the Americans to make terms. And this is a great story, and everybody knows it. But if you don't know it, you need to know it. But so the Germans approach, and the American general, a guy named McCulloch, sends back his response. So the Germans are saying, hey, listen, you guys are surrounded. We don't want to kill everybody. Just surrender, and it'll all be good. And the American general sends back one word: nuts.
Nuts. and the Germans said, well, does that mean yes or no? They had no idea.
Yeah, he didn't write noose. That would have been better even. Just send it back to him. But the point is the 82nd is part of this fight as well, and these guys had nothing. They're fighting in the snow. They're about to lose, and ultimately paratroopers are part of the rescue story for these guys too. And those guys, that's the Dirty Dozen, just the crazy story there where those guys come in. So when you go out with the 82nd, this is for the audience, Bob knows this, but when you go out with the 82nd, they're working to that standard. They don't want to let their ancestral army folk down, and they work extraordinarily hard. They push themselves and their bodies hard. And so when you're there, I don't know if it's true for Bob, but I bet it is. When I'm there and I'm trying to figure out how to be relevant, I'm keeping that standard in mind. And if they stay awake 20 hours, I stay awake 22. Did you have the same kind of feeling?
Absolutely. It's like even if you're a complete outsider, you have to live up to that standard or attempt to.
Yeah.
Or you might as well just go home. And you're working with people who are from small towns that nobody ever heard of, or farms, or the big city, and yet they would rather die than let the other guy win. It is an amazing organization, and those shoulder patches they wear, the All-Americans, they're really heavy with history, and it weighs on you. You cannot let these people down. If you do, you got a world of hurt coming your way.
Yeah, and then when I was in Baghdad, part of that unit are the paratrooper regiments, and they're not paratrooping anywhere. They're doing other things. Same standard applies though. Like we are willing to take these extraordinary steps to win. Not only to not let the enemy defeat us, but I'm not going to let the person to my left and right down. So even though they're not doing paratrooper stuff, now they're in an environment that they have no idea what to do, because they're prepared for that impossible situation and literally not prepared to do the other. It's an incredible task that we give our military to say, go create stability in Iraq, in Sadr City, in whatever place.
Right. Why not just create order out of the chaos of, the universe or something? Essentially that's what the mission is, that you have to settle something down, and not everything has a military solution, but you've got to be able to stabilize a situation that allows people to move forward in.
Yeah, I wanted to ask what your thoughts were, because you interviewed Muhammad Ali back when he wasn't able to fight because of his rejecting of the Vietnam War. Positive you were drafted because that was the era back then. But you had such a different fight compared to, say, Desert Storm. And then if you came into the modern time, because I do think that we've moved well past the Desert Storm fight. That's a different thing now. So how would you compare and contrast the last 50 years, as a guy that's chronicled these stories?
Well, and you're in luck. You're talking to a guy who had the last lottery number ever called and the last draft ever held.
Wow.
1972. Right. And Vietnam was over, so I didn't have to. I never left the States, but I served in a peacetime army, which was enough to give me basics on how the army works, how the military works. 18 years later, when I got to and I covered Desert Storm, well, that's a completely different mindset, because now the military's all volunteer. The Airborne's double volunteers. You volunteer to join the Army, then you volunteer to jump out of a plane. And they massed all this firepower together in just one supreme battle that nobody ever understood. And you figure, well, they finally learned their lesson. Somebody did. But then now in today's environment. And you talk about your multiple deployments and being back in Iraq and these just lovely garden spots in Afghanistan and Iraq. My heart goes out to everybody that had to go, and especially for the multiple deployments, because that's a burden. That's a lot. And you don't know. It goes back, reverts back to Vietnam a little bit. You don't know who the bad guys are. Yeah. If you could tell who the bad guys were, that stuff would be over in a month. But if you don't know who the bad guys are and who's working with who at what particular time, well, that's a completely different set of circumstances altogether. And then what government is going to survive after all this and move their people forward? So don't forget, the area that they're fighting in, they've been fighting the wars for 6,000 years.
Yeah.
And don't see an end to it anytime soon.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, Afghanistan, Yugoslavia for that matter, someone was always going through that portion of the world and dominating it. So it's always been in conflict. And the Middle East it just churns. That's the norm, and
it's written down in the Bible.
Yes.
The first book ever written was about war in the Middle East. So.
Yeah, that's for sure. I mean, everybody, the Greeks wrote about it, the Romans wrote about, everybody has had to deal with it. And it's okay. So this is the thing I've been thinking about. We're really hard on ourselves as a nation. The President Trump conversation aside, look, the guy does things that at best are problematic and at worst are criminal, right? So yes, he's a product. He's a reflection of us. When was the last time we loved a president as a nation? Not everybody's going to agree, but like President Reagan had good approval ratings. President Bush, the elder, had. But ever since about that time, we've had this split where we not just don't agree, but we loathe, hate, have this just desire to tear the president down, and that makes us all look bad, don't you think?
Yeah, it does. And go back. Franklin Roosevelt, and you say, well, he's the guy who pulled the country together during World War II. He had his critics.
Yeah.
His critics said, don't do this. You're crazy. Woodrow Wilson in World War I, the Senate did not even pass the peace treaty that he negotiated after the end of that conflict. So the guy in the hot seat just doesn't get 100% approval rating ever. Abraham Lincoln was killed because he led the country during war. And I go back to maybe George Bush the elder after Desert Storm had a 90% approval rating for how he handled that, and he didn't get reelected.
Right.
So what's that tell you?
Yeah. And everybody hated President Truman when he left office, but he's retired and become a better president since he's been dead 50 plus years.
Some things improve with age, like wine and cheese, and a few presidents, but some aren't going to look so good in the harsh light of history either.
So when we look at, we've been abroad, you and I, and when we look at how America performs, it's really easy to get lost in the day-to-day and think how we're just this bigoted, racist, hateful country. But the reality is this, we have come so far, and we continue to push forward. And this is just Pete talking, I'm not putting this on Bob, but if you look up civil rights movement, there's not an entry for a lot of other parts of the world. They just never had one. You can come to America and do a lot of things. We're not perfect. We have a lot of problems, but let's not be so hard on ourselves. If you go back 20 years, 40 years, 60 years, 80 years, look at the difference in where we are now and what's possible for a bunch of different people. We're doing all right. Doesn't mean that the work is over. We certainly have to keep pressing on. But, Bob, it drives me crazy when we're so hard on ourselves and think that the nation is such a terrible place when we not only have a stability here, we're able to go out to the Korean Peninsula and start to work. I'm not saying it's over, but start to work on stability there and ending an armistice that's 70 years old. There's almost nobody left alive from that war. And we're just now starting to thaw the ice. And that's because we say so, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And I wonder if you've had this experience, Pete. When you're away from the country, you leave the country, and you can look back and then you're in this horrible situation, and then you say, you know what? Back home, well, we got a beautiful country with great natural resources. Yeah, it's an amalgamation of people, and everybody's trying to get along, and sometimes there's some friction. But I really learned to appreciate America by being away from it in some of these countries that have it a lot worse than us. But and look at what we're trying to build as a country. You've got different races, different religions, different points of view, different points of from a geographical standpoint. The Northeast and the Southwest, or the Southeast and the Northwest, the Great Plains. It's just such a big jumble of things that all work together when it has to. So yeah, I agree. I got a much different appreciation for the United States of America when I was outside of it, and then having returned to it. And it wears on me sometimes and say, look, the stuff you're worried about and you're arguing about is trivial. It doesn't mean a thing. It don't mean nothing when you look at the big picture.
Are you leading me into drive on? Is that what you're leading me? Don't mean nothing, drive on. Be a little.
Drive on's one of those. It's an airborne term.
Sure.
It's like, yeah, we know. Look, you just went through something that's the worst situation ever. They just got to pick it up and drive on, saddle up and drive on.
Yeah, well, let's make sure we plug the book. That's Bob's new book. It's called Drive On. You can go check it out on Facebook. Just type in Drive On. The Uncensored War of Bedouin Bob and the All-Americans. That's the 82nd Airborne. You can also go to Amazon and buy any of his books there, including the Spanish version of the Jeffery Dahmer tales in there.
You saw that?
I did.
There's a German version, too, because he was based in Europe when he was in Germany.
That's great.
So he had a little history there.
Yeah. Actually,
something I wanted to get back to you about when you're talking about the writers.
Yeah.
In World War II, when you go back to this era, there's a guy named Ernie Pyle.
Sure.
He went out and lived with the troops, and he wrote his stories from the foxhole level, the ground level, and he could relate to other people back home by the way he wrote rather than writing through headquarters. But in today's day and age, how many writers, and there are fewer and fewer writers as the newspaper industry shrinks, have any kind of military experience? They go to the schools and they write, but they've never had to do push-ups in the mud or sight in an M16 in the wind. So,
or drive on. How often in life do you have to? Okay, look, life will make you drive on, but when you don't have to drive on.
This episode of the Break It Down Show is brought to you by Lions Rock Productions.
That's us.
We publish, evaluate, and develop podcasts just like this one, consult others to build their own, and create associated content and content marketing strategies.
So if you're launching or expanding your social media presence, your business or your personal brand, or if you just want to take your media presence to the next level,
reach out to us on Twitter
at Pete A. Turner
or at JohnLG69
at the Break It Down Show.
There's 1,000 ways to get a hold of us.
Now enjoy the show.
When you don't have to drive on, but you do, it's a different thing. I'll give you an example of what that means for the audience. We're on a patrol. It's as hot as it can fucking be, and we're walking over rocks all day long. So everything's heat soaked. Your ceramic plate that keeps you safe from bullets is heat soaked. Everything on you is hot. When someone in the patrol, and I'm kind of like, because I'm not in, I'm with the Army. When someone out there is like talking, I'll kind of be like your uncle. So I'll walk over to him and I'll say, hey man, how's it going? And you can see him struggling, and I'm just trying to teach him about drive on because they're young and they don't know. And they're like, oh man, it's so hot. Like, you know what? Everybody knows it's hot. No reason to bring it up. Let's talk about something else,
Get your mind off of it. Exactly.
Yeah. That's not something that you have to necessarily do in day-to-day life. And then when you do have to do it, there isn't someone who's pointing a gun at you and deciding whether or not to squeeze the trigger.
That's another element that people don't get used to is the stuff coming back at you the other way, or walking through some little piece of ground where there might be some nasty stuff planted in the ground that could take your leg off or turn you into pink mist. You learn to tread real carefully.
Yeah, this is part of that compare and contrast I was asking you to think about. Obviously, it's not the Vietnam fight and it's not the Gulf War fight, which I think obsoleted all of that kind of stuff. Like we showed the capacity for an international force moving at a fast pace. Most nations are like, there's no point in developing a state-on-state warfare capacity, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. There would be no military in the world in its right mind would ever take on the American military in a straight-up fight. It would be pointless. They would be so outgunned, outclassed, and outperformed. It would be committing suicide. But the way to nibble at the edges with these religious wars, with these fanatics, is to become stealth infantry in a way that you blend into the local population. You can't tell the bad guys from the good guys. They hit you at night when you're not expecting it, or they dress up in friendly uniforms and come at you that way. It's a totally what do they call this? An asymmetrical battlefield, which is a nice way of saying you're screwed.
Yeah, asymmetrical, I don't think even covers it, because you're talking small versus big or whatever. It's really a spherical battlefield with multiple ways of combating things. So this is how I see it. Obviously, there's a military aspect, but we tend to dominate that. I mean, no one's had air superiority over us in 50 years. You can go be great at tanks, but you're not going to use tanks to win these wars. So military stops being effective, and you've got to deal with a social, a cultural, a political, a religious aspect to fighting. And if you can't move people emotionally, and I talk about affect over effect, if you can't get people to move towards the central government or towards an objective emotionally, you're losing that fight.
Well, right, and you have to give them a way to earn a living and make a living. Find a way that they can feed their families where they don't have to go out and create an uproar or try to tear down civilization as they know it.
Yeah.
Instead of trying to tear something down, build it up. So it is more of a individual fight more than ever, I think, because the days of the big battlefield and moving corps and divisions and that is gone. That's over. I don't know what they're going to do with all that.
I don't know either. I saw a thing, and I'm not trying to belittle these folks that are still into that part of the warfare thing, but they put a picture up of the Russian airborne tank capability they have. There's like 7 parachutes off a tank, and I'm like, that's fine. If that's coming, first off, Russia has to decide to invade a place they can beat, because it's not doing it here.
Right.
Like that's just not. And then the amount of chaos that happens when you insert humans, not tanks. It's how many tanks do you have to drop to survive? Because I'll tell you, just dropping food off the back of an airplane, 5 to 10% of those pallets are coming straight to the ground without slowing down.
Yeah, you get the streamer. Yeah, that's the way it works.
Yeah.
You got to factor that in. So, but I think this is why they have these, places like West Point and the Naval Academy and the Air Force Academy, is to think ahead, is to try to project what this is going to be like in 10, 20, 30 years. How are we going to fight and who are we going to fight?
Yeah. So what do you think? Where are we going to be fighting in 10, 20 years?
That's a good question. I wish somebody would give me a sit rep right now about, what the last 17 years have been all about, or, why did we do this instead of that? And why? I think it's almost time to just say, wait a minute, let's all just back up and regroup and say what's going to happen next. Because to fight these individual clans, these tribes who are influenced by their own religions, that presents such a challenge. And to do it in a geographical area, if it means nothing to us, then why are we sticking our toe into that kind of an environment?
Yeah. There's the action arm of this, like when Syria was really hot and painful about a year ago, with all the images, all the kids and everything else. Everybody was upset, but nobody was willing to go and do something about it. It was,
Yeah, the only thing worse than sitting back and watching it unravel would be to go over there and be in the middle of it while it's unraveling.
Right.
And, I'll bring up this point. During Desert Storm, which was 1991, the Syrians were on our side. They were part of the alliance.
Right.
They sent an armored division into Saudi Arabia. Now, they didn't participate in the invasion, but I saw Syrian troops training.
Yeah.
Saw them pulling tanks off the ships. So that's how fast it can shift over there, like the sands.
There's I was over by Tuwaitha, which is an area where they had the nuclear reactor that Israel blew up. Mm-hmm. This is how complicated this area is. So this is for the audience. I'm in Iraq, and way back, a couple decades ago, the Israelis said the Iraqis have too much nuclear capability. They flew a jet in and blew up the nuclear plant, and it's basically in the same condition that it was back then. I mean, they cleaned out the nuclear stuff and everything else, but it's in there. If you ask, and this is no shit, if you ask the Iraqis in that area, Tuwaitha, around where they lived, who blew up the nuclear plant? Iran.
Yeah, is that right?
Absolutely true. So they that's how complicated the world is. Like, this is a fact. We all know the Israelis did it and understand why, and it's all been known for years. Those folks there, nope, that was Iran. That was Iran trying to harm us. So when you go to these areas, how do you reckon with what you have no idea, because it's not even possible to be true?
Well, right. And probably not only Iran, but it was the Shiites in Iran, because here in Iraq, we're Sunnis mostly.
Yeah.
And, then you get into that whole dynamic, and I swear it's biblical, because it all goes back to the original Cain and Abel thing.
Yeah, it does go way back like that, doesn't it? I wanted to ask you about your book now. What kind of reception are you getting from folks in the 82nd?
Actually, it's a paratrooper tested and paratrooper approved.
Nice.
I mean, I think one. They kind of looked at me like, oh, you're crazier than us to be out here to write about this. But somebody took the time to live with them and to go to war with them and then write it down to preserve their history. They just thought it was just the greatest thing. And I've been back to brag a couple of times since the end of that war. And there are people in airborne infantry companies that call me brother.
Yeah.
And yeah, wrap your head around that. That's the greatest honor I've ever had in my life. And you always worry. You say, I'm writing this, and it's going to be raw, and it's going to be real, and I got to tell it like it is without sugarcoating anything. And that's the parts that they love the most. They said, yeah, you talk like we talk. You got to F-bomb every other word. And yeah, that's the way it was really like. It was just like that. So they really endorsed it wholeheartedly by their support. And everybody wants their slice of history written.
Yeah.
Too. Yeah, 82nd Airborne, okay, you jumped into Normandy at night. Fine, we get it. But what about, the guys in Nam, the guys in Iraq, the guys who are fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan now? They too have their story to tell, and they own a piece of that division history that ought to be preserved, because I think that spirit that their forefathers had still lives with them while they fight a completely different war under completely different circumstances.
And for the audience probably wouldn't know this, and maybe you've seen it on military flags, but in the Army in particular, you'll have a unit flag. So the 3rd Brigade Combat Team, the 82nd Division, has a flag, and on that flag there are what are called streamers. And it's just a little 3-inch or so wide ribbon, but on that ribbon are the words of the fights of the battle. So there's a ribbon that says Market Garden. There's a ribbon that says Battle of the Bulge. And that list isn't getting shorter. It's getting longer. There's more ribbons on that thing.
Right.
And each one of those things is 100 books. Each one of those ribbons is an incredible multi-person tale that luckily nowadays we get a chance to write these books sooner. Companies like Tactical 16 make it easier for an emerging author to write something. I mean, you take it to Random House, you're an established author. If they're like, hey, take a pass, it doesn't mean it's not a good story. It just means they can't sell it.
Right. They make business decisions.
Yeah.
They say, well, I don't know what the market for this will be beyond a certain niche. And I say, no, it's a human story. It's like the Greeks and the Romans used to tell. It's the Odyssey. and the Iliad, and some bean counter blinks at you and says, "No, that's not going to happen."
What? No, I don't know what those are. I went to state school. Yeah, you're 100% right. The other thing is as someone who's a chronicler, you are writing a piece of that fight. So Ernie Pyle, continued to be relevant in the storytelling world past his death. I mean, he's not alive anymore, and his passing is somewhat recent, but he told the story from a point of view that is rarely done in the modern time. And it's great. And that whole Pacific miniseries where they had, I can't remember the other author's name, but My Helmet for a Pillow was his book, I think. They told these really visceral, hard stories. It's incredible.
Right. You can relate to the human being, the American that we send over to do this job, and you can relate to the misery and the suffering that he goes through, or she goes through, just living in the environment and eating that awful food and not knowing if you're going to make it to the next day or not. So each day becomes its own epic, its own event. And it's a little series of victories. You made it through another day.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, this is one of the things that I've noticed, and this for the audience, I've been in a lot of combat. I've seen a lot of this stuff. So there's the conversation about females in combat units and, the fact that they can't do push-ups and all that kind of stuff. Eugene Sledge, that was the other guy's name.
Sledgehammer, you're right.
So,
he was a Marine. Yeah.
What a great...
And he kept a journal in his Bible. He wrote down a little notation.
Yeah, and if you guys haven't read that book, you have to read it. It's so good. It's so good. Yeah, so, that book is... I'm going to actually read that book again. It's so great. So here's the thing that I've noticed, Bob, is that we have this conversation about females in combat, but we live in a free society with an all-volunteer force, and we base promotion based on the branch of service and the thing that you're in. So if women can't be in infantry, that sort of goes against who we are as a nation. I've seen a lot of women in combat roles. I've seen tiny little girls standing up in the back of an Up Armor Humvee working a 50 cal, which is, I'll say, a man weapon. It is man-sized. It takes two people to pick up each piece of it. And just to rack the round, it's a big, powerful move. I've seen girls do that. If they can do that, and if they're pros and they can do their job, I personally don't have a problem with women in combat. And I've seen them do it. Now, look, that may not be the case for everybody else. What is your experience? What do you think?
Well, I kind of feel the same way. If an individual is willing enough to do that and go through the rigors, and that's what they want to do, who am I to say, no, you're not, you can't handle that because you're not physically able to do that. I just say, I know it's changed completely, and there are different points of view, but I don't have any problem with women out there. They'll make adjustments too. They can dig a hole in the sand and wrap a poncho around themselves to do an act of nature. That's not an issue. I always thought that they didn't allow women into combat units because there wouldn't be any prisoners of war. They'd wipe out anybody who was up against them. They wouldn't have any mercy on somebody who was trying to kill them.
Yeah, there wouldn't be a whole lot of mercy. And again, like the whole thing is like, well, don't lower the standards on physical fitness. Who says the standards are right? Ask me right now, Bob, how many push-ups I've done in combat. Ask me, go ahead.
Right. How many push-ups have you done in
Zero.
combat?
I've never thought, now's the time to start knocking out 80 push-ups in 2 minutes. Like, I've never done it,
Yeah. Let's go for a 2-mile run this morning before we take on the Republican Guard Division.
I mean, you have to be somewhat physically fit, but you don't have to be, and not that the military physical fitness standard is extraordinary, but it doesn't mean that it's relevant to the fight that we have nowadays.
Yeah, it's so hidebound in its traditions that somebody said this is what you have to do, and nobody's ever going to reevaluate and say, well, maybe we ought to, why do we teach people to swim if we're going to send them into the desert? That all of that.
Yeah. Right. And then the other thing is always like, a girl can't carry a 200-pound man. You know what? First off, everybody weighs more than 200. Even the girls weigh more than 200 pounds when you're in combat because you have so much gear on. Nobody's picking anybody up. That's not how it works. You know, like that kind of fighting, yes, it happens on occasion, but still, no one's like, I got you, bro, and throws him on their shoulder and runs off. It doesn't happen that way. Never.
With the fireman's carry, yeah.
Right. Yeah. You get a litter, you get a couple of people, and a helicopter comes in when the fighting is over. If they're shooting, there's no helicopter coming in.
You're right about that.
It's a different time. Anyhow, look, I don't want to take all of your time, and it's been fun chatting. What else do you want to cover before we wrap this thing up?
I did write this book, which was a lead-in to the project I'm doing now about the 3rd Brigade in Vietnam. And it's, you have to go back to Vietnam and write about that ferocious, brutal, savage mess that we got ourselves into. But it's a brotherhood that exists 50 years later on. These guys had each other's backs back then, and they still have each other's backs. And they take care of each other. Fascinated by that bond. Shakespeare wrote about it, the band of brothers. And,
right.
It's real. The challenge is to put it down on paper in a way that people can relate to and understand.
Yeah, well, when you get that done, definitely come back on and talk about it. But really, seriously, anytime you want to come on and just chat, because you're a wealth of knowledge. You've seen so many things. Your lifetime spans such an interesting time. I mean, you were alive during like the heavy part of the 60s with all of the things that were going on there socially. And again, this goes back to that, hey, we can all ease up a little bit. We've come a long way. We're doing incredible things. It'd be great to have you on whenever you want to do something.
Sure. Quick story.
Please.
The 3rd Brigade of the 82nd Airborne in 1967 was called up to go put out the fires in Detroit.
Right.
67, and then 6 months later, they got called up to fight the fires in Hue, Vietnam.
Yeah.
And talk about a cultural sea change. And yeah, I was part of that then. And when you're a teenager, what are you thinking about? Trying to get dates and maybe sneak a beer somewhere and trying to survive in a world that's just exploding all the way around you. So yeah, I'm a veteran of that at the home front. I really enjoyed this, so you can have me back anytime.
Yes, arms up in the air. I'm winning. I love it. I love it.
Yes, I was going to say, anytime you want to do that, let me know, and be happy to help you out.
Yeah, and I'll extend this offer to you, too, because I'm starting to do this now. Anytime you want to, I want to have a podcast, and you want to bring someone on, man, I'm glad to host us and let you co-host with me, because the thing I'm realizing, there's too many people that want to do podcasts that just don't have the time, inclination to do a whole production, and who wants to put one show up or 2 shows up. So if you ever want to do something, don't hesitate to reach out and tell me, hey, I want to bring this guy on, because I'd love to have him, whoever that person is.
Okay. Yeah. Actually, I belong to it's called a Veterans Breakfast Club, and it's in the Pittsburgh area.
Oh, you know what I said? Never mind all that. Pittsburgh, off the limits.
Okay.
No. Go ahead. Your
He's
Breakfast
a
Club.
historian who had realized that every veteran has a story. So they get together for these breakfasts from time to time, and he puts on these events, and he just allows people to stand up and talk about what they went through. And it's from World War II on. There's still some old guys.
That's great. I'd love to capture whoever you got. And yeah, these World War II and Korean War guys, they're not going to last much longer. So we got to grab whatever we can from them now, while they can. All right, everybody. This again is Bob Dvorchak. You got to get his book. It's called Drive On. You can go to Facebook and you can just type in Drive On and you'll see Bob Dvorchak. Dvorchak spells pretty much exactly how you'd want to spell it. But if you're not sure, Dvorchak. You can find him on LinkedIn. You can always find him on Tactical 16. Thanks to you guys, Eric and Chris over there, for hooking up and being such great partners. I do these shows with people that write about these things because their stories are incredible. And I know from what you guys tell me as listeners that these books mean something to you. And so the way you can help out someone like Bob, and his book is rated at 5 stars on Amazon, by the way, is rate the books. When you rate the book, it gets bumped up in the rankings and it helps other people find it, and it helps out Bob, and we want him to keep writing stories. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Bob, and we'll have you on again soon.
Okay, Pete. Thank you. Great to be here.